A laptop for me is a utility. As a student, gamer, and yes, content creator, among other things, my laptop is supposed to be a very important tool that can do all the things that I need it to reasonably and be able to survive in a whole range of situations. This puts any laptop that lands in my lap into a bit of a difficult position, one of fairly high expectations. Simply put, it should be able to function as my main workstation. With that in mind, the Aspire 3 A314-22 has been my daily companion for the past few months, and I've got some thoughts regarding that. Acer's Aspire line is a value brand that targets people who look for bang for the buck laptops rather than premium ones. That means that it usually sacrifices things in the name of price and performance. Given that, the Aspire 3 is the budget end of that value brand, meaning that it has all the pros and cons of the upper Aspires, the Aspire 5 and 7, but with the added constraint of an even lower budget. Given that, the expectations for build quality aren't very high, but at least it should be fairly performant for the price. The Aspire 3 that I have is a 14-inch granite black model. As expected, it has a plastic chassis, but the quality of said plastic masks the cheap feel that you would otherwise get. Furthermore, the color styling of the granite black model makes it look very stealthy to the eye without outstanding ability to not stand out in many situations, something that not every laptop, by the way, especially gaming ones, can say. You won't be wowed by the build quality, obviously, but honestly, it's about on par or even slightly exceeding my expectations given the price and the level of performance that you get with it. The bottom of the device does have this cheap rippled plastic pattern, but since it's going to be on the table or resting in your lap like most of the time that you're actually using it, people would barely notice. Overall, it's a good showing, and I've had no hesitation into stuffing this into my backpack and taking it off in any scenarios. It's pretty solid overall. This configuration is equipped with a 1920 by 1080 Full HD TN panel, that's Full HD right there, with a advertised brightness of around 200 to 220 nits. This is, in my opinion, the worst part of the device. It is 1080p, which means that unlike some laptops in its class, it's still using 1366 by 768p displays. It's actually very sharp at 157 pixel per inch, which is plenty for a 14-inch display. However, being a TN panel, color accuracy and viewing angles, not to mention contrast, leave a lot to be desired. The brightness is also average nowadays, if not subpar, measuring in at around 238 nits, which is technically above spec, but it still gets destroyed by modern budget phones. It's bright enough for most indoor uses, though I definitely wouldn't recommend using this in harsh sunlight. You will not be able to see anything. The matte display helps a bit with glare, but it also hurts the contrast even more, which makes it appear less dark or black in some instances and more gray. Bezels are fairly average nowadays, standing at roughly 75% screen to bezel ratio. Not market leading by any stretch of the imagination, but it's on par with most laptops, especially in its class. Side bezels are a fair bit large, and the same goes with the forehead bezel on the top, but the chin bar is actually a fair bit thinner than some laptops in this class, and it balances things out. This essentially makes the overall footprint of the device to be exactly the same as any modern 14-incher in this price point. The layout of the inputs are pretty interesting. The keyboard is slightly recessed down, not because it has front-firing speakers, but probably because of the cooling solution, exhausting air in front of the display through this hinge. This results in having a smaller wrist rest area at the bottom. It's not that bad, my hands can fit on it, and so can probably most people's, but the downsized trackpad is a bit of a drag. It uses Windows Precision drivers, which is common nowadays, but it's still nice to see, meaning that it's fairly accurate and is capable of multi-touch gestures. The big problem here is the size. Scrolling is a chore with this trackpad, and I often find myself going over the edge when I'm using it, despite the months of getting used to it. The keyboard itself is alright, doesn't have the deep travel of Lenovo keyboards, but it's snappy enough for rapid style typing and is comfortable and stabilized enough for longer endurance ones. It's fine. I/O is actually pretty good overall on this laptop. On the left is the barrel plug for the charger, gigabit Ethernet, HDMI, and two USB 3.0 Type A ports. Those are, by the way, 5 gigabit variety. On the right is a Kensington lock, LED indicators, headphone microphone combo jack, and the lone USB 2.0 port. There's only really two notable things missing here: USB-C and an SD card reader. USB-C isn't a particularly big deal to me, but an SD card reader is, and it's been quite frustrating. As a content creator who uses a DSLR to film, which uses SD cards, it's very frustrating to have to pull out a USB hub in order to ingest footage and edit on the laptop. Yeah, it's a pain. The addition of wired Ethernet is pretty good though, especially if you're a gamer, and that is backed up by an Intel AC3168 Wi-Fi card for times when you can't plug it in, like when you're on the road, for example, with support for 5 GHz Wi-Fi up to 433 megabits per second and Bluetooth 4.2. The webcam is a 480p affair at the top of the screen, which is not that great nowadays. Framing is not that wide, and the resolution is quite literally from a decade or two ago. There's literally no excuse for not having at least a 720p webcam, especially in this price point. There's also webcam light, by the way, if you're into that sort of product privacy stuff, so good, I guess. It's backed up by a dual mic setup on the top bezel. It sounds like this. Mic quality is fine. I've had the noise cancelling things turned on, and it's okay for video calls, even with a fairly noisy environment. Sorry about that. Speakers are a downward firing affair. Stereo and spatial separation are decent. Bass and mids are okay, though the top end is very lacking, and it also doesn't get very loud. Enough foreplay though, let's talk about the specs. The Aspire 3 A314-22, as it's kitted out here, features a 15-watt AMD Ryzen 5 3500U CPU with 4 cores, 8 threads clocked at 2.1 GHz and can boost up to 3.7 GHz, with integrated Radeon Vega 8 graphics clocked up to 1200 MHz, partnered with 8 GB of DDR4 dual-channel 2400 MHz memory, 128 GB NVMe SSD, and a 1 TB hard drive. The whole pricing of this configuration comes out to about 28,000 pesos or $560 US. In the Philippine market, this is actually one of the best specs on paper in its price point. Despite being equipped with a 3-year-old CPU, market pricing for these kinds of specs hasn't really come down below 30,000 for last few years, at least until now. In the market, it is competing with newer i3s and Ryzen 3s, which have better architectures and are probably clocked higher, but could still pull ahead due to sheer core counts and clock speeds alone. Productivity tests are mostly focused on CPU performance, and it shows that this laptop is a pretty good performer overall. Compared to a similarly priced desktop configuration, it falls behind, in the neighborhood of around 25% less performance. But compared to a 35,000 peso laptop from 2019, it performs very similarly, which for something that costs 20% less 3 years later is pretty damn good. Actually, better than that, since the X509F is only equipped with 4 gigs of single-channel DDR4 memory, compared to the 8 gigs dual channel memory of the Aspire, allowing it to get outperformed by the Aspire in most tests, and especially ones where memory bandwidth is involved. The desktop, by the way, is also single channel, this time 8 gigabytes 2666, but it's able to come out ahead in pretty much all of the tests just based on sheer clock speed, core count, and TDP advantages. All these tests though shows that this laptop is a pretty good performer for photo editing, 1080p video editing, small CAD assemblies, simple 3D modeling, programming, basically a lot of simple to mid-complex productivity and office tasks, which is pretty good all around, especially for someone like me who usually spends his day browsing the web and typing away school stuff in MS Office, but also spends a lot of time doing some video editing in Premiere, photo editing in Photoshop and Lightroom, and some basic to mid-complex coding in Visual Studio. But I don't just spend my time working. A lot of times I just like to sit back and relax and play a couple of games of CSGO and Rocket League. For that, it's also a fairly good machine, at least relatively speaking. It can play a lot of games in its native 1080p resolution at 30 or even 60 FPS with low to medium settings, depending on how heavy the game is, obviously. And while it might not be ideal when a desktop with a low-end GPU is 3 times faster for the same cost, for someone who values productivity and flexibility in how they work or play, this is more than good enough. You'd have a fairly long game or work session too. With a 42 watt-hour battery, this can last over an hour of gameplay with details fairly cranked and no FPS cap. You can probably push it to around 2 hours by just reducing settings and enforcing a 30 FPS cap limit. In normal usage, this can routinely last me 6 to 8 hours, 3 to 4 if something you're doing is fairly intensive. In short, this can last for a full workday if you happen to forget its 45 watt charger, which can charge the laptop in an hour or less, which is actually pretty fast. It's pretty good. Thermals, though, are a bit confusing. In a CPU-heavy Cinebench R20 run, we see temps spiking rapidly to around 80 degrees and continues to climb all the way to 90 degrees. During this time, the CPU tries to maintain in the neighborhood of 2.9 to 3.1 GHz across all 4 cores, with the fan rapidly increasing its speed to keep up with the heat. It then throttles down after reaching 90 degrees to around base clock to lower the temperatures back down to around 80 degrees, at which point the CPU will turbo up again to around 2.9 to 2.6 to 2.9 GHz before dropping back down to 80 degrees after it hits that 90 degree thermal throttling point. The fan curve, which follows temperatures, is about as erratic as you would expect given these circumstances, and the ramp up and down is very noticeable to the user. This makes performance actually fairly inconsistent, which is not what you want. On a throttling test, you can see performance dropping off after just a couple of runs, and then settling off as the cooler gets soaked. I don't really know what the solution to this is, maybe less aggressive voltages and a better cooling solution, but that's not something that you can really change, at least in the context of voltages, not easily. I'll get to that in a bit. So as it is, it's kind of a mess. Skin temperatures, at least, are alright. On the wrist area, it essentially doesn't heat up that much, if at all, and most of the keyboard remains fairly okay to the touch. However, it does get warm on the right side vent area that I talked about, and the WASD does get pretty hot if the cooler gets soaked because the APU is located right there. This makes it a bit uncomfortable for long gaming sessions, though plugging in an external keyboard and using that obviously solves it. The load on gaming is more GPU than CPU, and even though they are the same silicon, using the iGPU doesn't actually put as much load on the cooling solution as with a pure CPU stress test. The Vega 8 routinely clocks around 400 to 900 MHz sustained depending on the game you're playing, and APU temps remain around below 90 degrees, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 85 depending on ambient. It doesn't really reach the throttling point unless you really choke that cooler or in a very hot environment. When it does hit 90 degrees though, both CPU and GPU will downclock to compensate, which actually produces very visible stutters that you will notice and that will probably ruin your game if you're at the very wrong timing. Most of the time though, it's alright so long as you keep this the bottom of the device fairly open to air. No device is perfect. Even extremely expensive devices have their flaws. This becomes especially apparent in the budget to mid-range market, where to be strong in one aspect is to sacrifice another. The Aspire 3 has, in my opinion, made a pretty good balance of build quality, performance, and portability. Its main drawbacks are the underwhelming screen, terrible webcam, inconsistent performance, and sometimes borderline thermals. But what you get is an overall great performance for the price, fairly long battery life, and good enough build quality to be able to survive in a lot of conditions. Overall, especially for the price in this market, this is a pretty good deal if what you're looking for is a mix of good enough performance and portability, which is exactly what a student like myself is looking for. Competition does exist, and with a 3-year-old APU, it may eventually be outclassed. But if pricing history is anything to go by, it may just drop down its price and continue to be relevant. For now though, the Aspire 3 A314-22 is a pretty good laptop for the price, if you can live with the terrible screen, and it will most definitely satisfy my needs for actually many years to come. Oh, I didn't do it. Cut!